If your crop doesn't have adequate plant food, it's not going to reach its yield potential. And one of the ways that a lot of farmers are putting fertility plant food into the field is right in furrow in a lot of different crops. So we wanted to get into that today in terms of what you can use safely on your farm.
Well, that's the big thing. You know, we have to put plant food out there for our crops in order for them to really yield well. But to do that, you don't want to do it at the expense of injuring some of those plants. Let me give you a good example. If you're putting fertilizer in the furrow, there's a rate that your plants can tolerate, and there's a rate where you just get too much fertilizer in there and you could have injury on the seed. On dry years especially, when you've got fertilizer, something that's going to draw some water to it, if you have some seed that starts germinating, all of a sudden the rain quits, that fertilizer could actually pull moisture back away from your seed and cause some injury to those plants.
Well, the other thing that I get really concerned about is the salt level that comes in that fertilizer. You think about salt for just a second. So let's say you're a non-farmer and you think about salt as, oh, I sprinkle a little bit on my meat or whatever. You know, a little bit of salt is fine. And yeah, a little bit of salt is fine. You know what? Even plants can use a little bit of salt. The problem is if they get too much salt, that actually can dramatically hurt the plant. In fact, it could even kill it if there's so much salt. So you don't want high loads of salt in that furrow when you've got a tiny little seed and seedling.
Well, here's the problem that we run into though, Brian, is let's just say we need some phosphorus and we can't get it out there any other way. We're going to put it out as a liquid. We're going to throw it in furrow. And so you run to town, you ask your dealer, well, what do you got? And they say, well, I've got some 1034O here. And you start figuring out how many pounds of phosphorus that is actually going to deliver to your plants and how many gallons you're going to need to use. Oh man, I need to use 10 gallons of 1034O. Well, my only way to put it on is in the furrow. That is so risky because about 3 gallons is all you can tolerate.
Well, maybe that's all you can tolerate. That's kind of our general rule is 3 gallons of 1034O in 30-inch rows for corn is about the maximum. And the reason why we say 3 gallons, that gives you about 5 pounds of salt per acre. And in 30-inch rows in corn, that's about what we want. Now, if we're switching over to soybeans, that's a more sensitive crop, then I want to cut that down way more than that. I only want 1 gallon of 1034O on in furrow. And either way, whether I'm planting corn or soybeans or any crop, I'd prefer to not have the fertilizer directly on the seed. I'd like to have it just off to the side, in the sidewall.
I pick on 1034O a little bit because it's one of the most popular liquid fertilizer products farmers are using. The thing that Brad and I look at for our farm when we're going to be putting fertilizer in the furrow is why take that chance? Why use something that has that much salt in it? That's why we've looked at some other products that are much lower in salt. For example, on my farm, I use a product called Pro Germinator as my phosphorus source. It's a 924-3, but it's also got a chelation process that helps that product move into the plant more effectively. So I use a 1034O. How much of that phosphorus am I really going to get into my plants? Well, I'm not going to get a huge percentage of it. It's not too bad, but I'm not going to get 90% of that into my plants. When I'm using something like Pro Germinator with their special technology called flavanols, I am going to get that product into my plant, and it's got hardly any salt in it. In fact, it's about the lowest salt product we've been able to find, so I do safely use that in furrow, and I can use all my phosphorus needs if I need to.
Yeah, so don't start thinking that, well, we really want you to just use one certain product. The whole point here is we want you thinking about, in general, you need to use low salt products that are going to give you yield response. And also, it's not just yield. I mean, yield is nice, but the other thing when you start talking about corn is dry down. If I have corn that's a point drier or 2 points drier in the fall, that's worth a tremendous amount of money. On 200 bushel corn, if I've got, let's call it 6 cents a point for drying cost, that's $12 an acre. So 1 point is $12 an acre. Well, if I only invested $5 or $10, then I got a gain just on the fact that the corn was drier in the fall. And a lot of times what we found on our own farm is we're only gaining a bushel or two when we're putting down the in-furrow fertilizer when we have high fertility levels to start with out in the field, but we're gaining a point or two in terms of dryness in the fall, so it makes it well worth it overall.
Well, let's talk about some other products. Nitrogen, for example. We get questions all the time. Can I put any nitrogen in the furrow? No. You don't want to be putting a whole bunch of nitrogen in there. Now, if you're using a blend like the 924-3 that I talked about, you're not really putting very much nitrogen at all in there. That's no big deal. But if you said, hey, I got 10 gallons of 28% that I need to get on, putting it in the furrow is going to be very, very risky, and chances are you're going to have some big problems.
All right, speaking of other products, something that you probably do want to put out there would be micronutrients, but you got to keep the rate relatively low. We're talking 1 quart to 2 quarts of an acre of a blended micronutrient product, and that's whether you're planting corn or soybeans or a number of other crops. We like having the micronutrients relatively close to where the roots are going to be because you're only putting just a dab, just a pinch bunch of micronutrients out there, and if you have them 6 inches away or maybe 2 feet away from where the roots are potentially going to be, how do you know that they're going to get absorbed? So we want to have our micronutrients relatively close.
The other thing that we've tried just a little bit of in furrow is some sulfur. Now, sulfur can be very harmful to seed if you get very much concentration around that seed. I've been playing with just a low rate of sulfur right in the furrow. Haven't run into any problems yet, but it is a little risky. Everybody that I talk to, when I say, I'm going to try just a little bit of sulfur in that furrow, they're like, wow, you better keep that rate very, very low.
See, the reason why I don't want nitrogen and sulfur in furrow is not just that it has the potential to hurt the seed, but also those products are leachable. So I can put nitrogen and sulfur broadcast in the soil. It's going to move down, and it can move a little bit side to side too. So to get those to the roots is not as much of a challenge. Now, when you have nutrients like, let's say, phosphorus, that doesn't move hardly at all in soil. Another one that moves hardly at all in soil is potassium. So if you're going to put potassium in furrow, let's say, potassium can be really hard on seed too. You've got to find a source that's tremendously low salt, and that's difficult to do with potassium.
Well, it certainly is. I use Sure-K, but I get questions all the time from guys, well, what about my potash? I could ban just a little bit of dry right in the furrow. I'm not a big fan of dry at all, and potash has chlorine in it, and I definitely don't want to have that right around my seed. So you have to be cautious. You can't just put any fertilizer in the furrow. You could easily hurt your seed, and then you end up hurting yourself a lot more than any good you could potentially do.
And that's the whole thing with our talk here today. We're all for investing money on the farm. We just don't want you to invest that money and then get a yield loss or have a stand loss. That's a bad thing. So just be really careful which pop-up fertilizers you're picking on your farm. If you're going to put anything in furrow, it's got to be relatively safe to the seed.
Well, the other good thing about putting that fertilizer right close to the seed is it's further away from our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?